So, we had a Zoom call with each of your peer groups. We had pastors, staff, and lay leaders. And given what we heard in the Zoom calls, we decided to focus this webinar on initial strategies for introducing the concept of calling to a congregation. So I am going to make sure, Jesse, you are recording this. It doesn't look like I can record it as well. So we'll just go with that option. It's not showing up. It's an option for me. So what I'm going to do today to start us off is to share some findings from a program that we did called Exploring Vocation in Community. And I've referred to it a few times as kind of like a beta version of what you all are doing. Because it was similar in some respects to what the Lilly Endowment then proposed for this bigger initiative. And what I'm going to do is share what those churches who were a part of that program learned from focusing on vocation for a year in their communities. So it's a much smaller scope than what all of you are doing, but we learned some really valuable things from that project that actually shaped how we put this initiative together. And I think that some of what those congregations learned will be very helpful for you in terms of practical ideas for starting your own efforts in your local community. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to start us off by giving kind of an overview of what that program was about and share some of the findings from the churches that were part of that project. And then we're going to hear kind of a case study, if you will, from one of those congregations' work on vocation. And that's actually going to come to us from one of our pastors in this initiative. And Chris Broadway-Bauman is now with First Congregational Church in Boulder, Colorado. But she was a member of this previous program when she was the pastor of Wellesley Village Church in Massachusetts. So at a very, at a different church, they did a big effort on vocation that I think you'll be really interested to hear about because it evolved over a number of years and it kind of took on a different focus each time, and they really learned a lot. So when we thought about doing this webinar on practical ideas, I knew that Chris was a really wise and experienced voice that we wanted to have in the conversation. So after Chris kind of presents what her congregation did as part of the program, we will have about 15 minutes, I'm hoping, for some discussion and for questions from you. So just in terms of the flow of the webinar, I'll ask you just to hold your questions till the end, but we'll be sure to leave plenty of time so that you can ask questions if there's specifics about what other churches did that you're interested to know more about, or if you've got particular questions that your team is really wrestling with or curious about how others might respond, feel free to ask those, because we do hope this can be a good time for thinking about the real nuts and bolts of your own project and some of your ideas as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. We're going to, oh, come on, let's see, run this PowerPoint to keep our conversation going here. Can you all nod? Can you see that now? Is that showing up? Okay, wonderful. So, let's see here. Make sure why that is showing up in this way. Here we go, perfect. So some creative strategies on calling are what we hope to look at in this webinar today. And as I said, this program was called Exploring Vocation in Community. We often refer to it as EVC, so I may slip into that shorthand. But the reason we decided to start this effort with congregations was something that was born out of the work at the Collegeville Institute that preceded our initiative that we're part of today. So the Collegeville Institute seminars was an ecumenical interdisciplinary project that did these research seminars on vocation. And Kathleen and I talked a bit about that at the opening retreats. Some of the work that we did on vocation in the professions, vocation across the lifespan. But those seminars really wanted their theological work to be very deeply grounded in the reality of the life of the church today. So the seminars wanted to collaborate with congregations who were also interested in exploring questions of calling. So this effort, this EVC program, was part of our grounded research in the seminars. We really wanted to listen to Christians in their congregations about their sense of call, really keep our ears close to the ground. And we also desired to create resources that would serve the church. So part of our initial vision for the program is spelled out here, that it's not our goal to develop resources for churches, but rather to learn from and with churches as part of our research. We believe that congregational leaders and members are best positioned to create resources on vocation that speak to their particular context in terms of size, history, mission, demographics, and geographic location. So this Exploring Vocation and Community program was really created with the goal of resourcing congregations, just like yours, to engage the topic of vocation within their particular communities, so we could inform that theological work of the seminars in order to serve the broader life of the church, to learn how people, responded to these questions of calling. So the way that we designed the program was, in some ways similar to what the Lilly Endowment put together. We put together actually 2 different cohorts. Each of them had 5 congregations, and we actually invited them into the program. So these were congregations that we had a relationship with through the Collegeville Institute already. And we developed kind of a peer learning model similar to what all of you will be going through. We really wanted this to be a hub, a time and place where congregations could come together and learn from each other. And what we did was we gathered the first cohort of 5 congregations in Collegeville and introduced them to the theology of vocation that was being developed in our project. And then we sent them back home to work on some kind of effort in their local congregation that would engage this topic of calling. So, we worked with them over the span of just a year, and they got only $1,000 in funding. What we're thinking, I'm not sure, just a little seed money, I guess. But the goal was to have them implement some kind of self-designed project on vocation in their community. So all of that probably sounds a bit familiar to you. The cohorts themselves, we had a first group that started in October 2011, and then we added a second cohort of 5 congregations in 2012. So we ran this program for 2 years. And within the whole program, we had 2 Episcopal congregations, 2 Lutheran churches, ELCA, 2 United Church of Christ congregations, 2 Catholic parishes, and then we kind of had a couple interesting outliers. We had a Benedictine retreat center and an urban Salesian monasteries outreach ministry. So again, as with our group, we really tried for some denominational diversity to make it a very rich ecumenical gathering. And we actually ended up with some pretty interesting demographic diversity as well. We had 3 suburban churches, 4 urban, 2 from mid-sized college towns, and 1 from a rural small town. So that was really interesting to see how those different contexts ended up engaging the topic of vocation. So in the link that we sent to you to start this webinar, we had included a link to the Collegeville Institute website where we had a list of those congregations and a little bit about their projects on vocation. We'll send that out again to you with a couple other resources if you're interested in checking out a little bit more about the specifics of their project. But I wanted to highlight just a couple things that a few of the churches did to sort of give you a sense of what their projects were like. Again, just over the span of 1 year, they did this work. So we had a congregational church in Lawrence, Kansas, that had a lot of healthcare professionals in their congregation. So they decided to take our Called to Life program and offer it for healthcare professionals. And so they really got to dive deeply into, what did it mean to be a nurse, a physician, a nurse's assistant. And then they capped it off with a day of reflection around calling and around, national healthcare issues. They had a nationally known speaker on healthcare who came in and kind of led them through that reflection. So that was that church's project on vocation. We had a Lutheran church here in Minnesota that decided to pair adults with youth in the gifts discernment part of their confirmation program. So they thought, what would it look like to not just do this gifts discernment work with our youth as they're getting ready for confirmation, but actually to bring older adults in and have them talk about their own gifts and how those manifest themselves in their sense of calling. And they also, the pastors, went and collected some vocation stories from their members to use as video clips during worship. So that was kind of a creative use of technology that they did around getting people to share their stories in worship. We had a big Episcopal church in Hyde Park near Chicago that took our Call to Life program and kind of made it completely their own. They rewrote a whole curricula called Call to Love, and really made some high quality readers for curriculum for adults in small groups. And they actually did then a second year on their own. They did a similar kind of a program. So they really kind of made their own small group program on vocation, drawing from some of our materials. And then we had another small Lutheran church, actually right near Collegeville, Minnesota, that decided they were going to take on calling as their focus during Lent. And so they wove it into almost everything that their congregation did during Lent. They had home devotionals that they came up with on calling. They did small groups. They did a children's puppet ministry. Never thought that would be something on vocation, but they had a puppet ministry for kids that they engaged the topic of calling with kids. And then they did some really interesting Wednesday worship services for Lent that brought in professionals from their congregation who shared each week about how they live out their sense of vocation. So that Wednesday service was a part of their Lenten tradition in the past, and they really decided to focus it on vocation and calling that year, which was really interesting. And then they actually ended up at the end of the year hosting a synod-wide event on connecting worship with vocation. So again, a really interesting way that they were able to draw others into their work as well. So at the very end of the whole program, at the end of the 2 years that we ran, we decided to bring all 10 groups to Collegeville for kind of one big capstone meeting. And as part of that meeting, we did some pretty thorough evaluation of the program. And we found that all the congregations who participated said that the project had either a very high to medium impact on their community, which was significant. And almost all of them said they planned to continue engaging the topic of vocation, which was also really promising for us. And we had done a little survey to kind of get a sense of the impact of this work on vocation with their communities. And so I just pulled some of the quotes from that group just to share a little bit about their words with you. Parishioners became more aware of their own stories and the stories of others so that they were able to understand call as something multiple and changing throughout life. They found meaning in what they thought were failed callings of the past and discerned how suffering led to new lives. So some interesting feedback about that. And then another pastor said, what has surprised me most about doing this work has been the number of men and women of different ages and cultural backgrounds and faith traditions that are deeply drawn to these questions of call. So that was really significant too. And we heard that from a number of the pastors, that this really was a topic that got a high level of engagement with their congregation as well. In terms of what the congregations ended up doing with their own projects on vocation, we did find that congregations were more likely to use or adapt our resources on vocation than to create their own. And in some ways, we had really started the program hoping that congregations might develop some really creative resources on vocation. But what we found was that a common challenge was, this will surprise no one, they needed more time and they needed more money, more resources to really support their staff in this work and to support the creation of new resources on vocation. So in many ways, that was what really excited us about this new program, was the idea that we would have 5 years and significantly more resources to offer congregations around doing similar work. So another common challenge that we found among the groups that I think many of you are already encountering is they did find that there was pretty low resonance with the language of vocation. They really found that they needed to kind of dig into their own tradition, their own language to find, what kind of words or concepts would really speak to the people in their congregation. So some of them decided to take on those more traditional terms like calling and kind of breathe some new life into it. And others said, you know what, in our context, we really talk about ministry and daily life. That's what we're going to call this. And that worked well for them. So again, as I said, many of them did end up using our resources in some way throughout the year, but they also reported back to us that the top 3 things they needed to keep working on vocation were short books on vocation that they could read, in kind of an adult group, maybe a book group. So short books on vocation, small group curricula. Again, that was really something that worked well for them. And then they also wanted more videos. Many of them wanted kind of video clips they could show even in worship. So we decided to, kind of start creating some of those resources in response to what they needed. And then they also, in that final meeting in Collegeville, when we brought all 10 congregations together, they really shared some great, what I would call best practices for engaging vocation in congregations. And this is really kind of the heart of what I'm hoping will spark some of your own thinking around what your groups are going to do. So these are really some of the best practices that we heard from many of the congregations, all told. First and foremost, we really saw the need to engage multiple strategies for vocation. Groups that kind of went all in on just doing one thing, like we're going to just do small groups during Lent or Pentecost this year. That ultimately was less successful than trying to do maybe small groups and a sermon series, or in some way to get, vocation into worship, or to get it into Sunday school. They really needed to think strategically about multiple touch points for people in their congregation to engage the topic of calling. As I mentioned, a number of them did use some of the small group resources, the small group programs we had developed, like Call to Life and Call to Work. A number of them did use them, but the most successful ones were able to adapt those for their own context. So they didn't just kind of take what we did and use that, but they really looked at, what might be some additional readings that we could work into this? What would work well in our context? So I think adapting existing resources is a key approach. A number of congregations found it really fruitful to connect with their members around the idea of multiple callings. So, our lives are so full of, stress and scatteredness, and people really feel that pull between work and relationships and family. So really engaging that head on with talking about the idea that God calls us to multiple people, places, kinds of work, how do we respond faithfully in that? That idea of multiple callings was really fruitful for these churches. And then a number of them worked within the church year as well, looking at maybe Lent as a time to offer a small group series, or other moments in worship that went along with the church year, however they celebrated that, as really kind of weaving vocation into what they already did. We also saw that groups often found it really helpful to start with established groups or ministries within the congregation. So rather than creating something brand new that people would have to join, they often said, well, what if we did this with the parents group, or we tried something with the catechists, or we did this with the youth and the confirmation, or we take it on with this Bible study group. Starting with what's already working in the congregation was really helpful for a lot of these churches. We saw a number of congregations that came up with creative ways to invite their own members to share their stories, their sense of calling, which was helpful to model storytelling for others in the congregation in turn. So some did a panel discussion, like after worship during their fellowship time, where they'd have different professionals or people from different walks of life talk about their sense of calling. Others did testimonies during worship, but they really invited their own people to share their stories, and that was really fruitful. And then finally, several of them offered profession-specific groups or gatherings. A couple of them even did some interesting intergenerational work where they got like new professionals who were just starting in their fields really excited to be getting going. And then pairing them with retiring professionals who were really ready to step into that mentoring position. So profession-specific initiatives worked really well. And then these congregations finally also left us with their own ideas for what they would suggest to other churches. And I thought that would be interesting to share with you as well. So when they were thinking about their own work going forward in terms of future work around calling, they saw the need, many of them, to connect gifts discernment with calling. So to really do some intentional work with their members around gifts discernment as a way to start thinking about, okay, if God's given me this gift, how am I actually living that out through whatever my calling would be? They also talked about the need to really connect personal vocation with the common good, to really get justice into people's consideration of vocation, that it's not just kind of a self-fulfillment thing, you know, where we often hear about that in popular culture, but really to say that a Christian vocation is deeply concerned with the good of our neighbors, with social justice. I remember several pastors talking about their desire to think about how to invite people proactively into conversations about vocation, that they notice that, you know, really it's often a point of crisis that leads us to start thinking about our sense of calling. And so they kind of openly wondered, what would it be like to think about how we would do that proactively before people get to those points of crisis? So I thought that was an interesting finding as well. And then a number of them said, you know, we really need to keep creating resources for worship, because that is where we reach the most people as a congregation, that's really important for them as well. Finally, there were some of them that were really inspired by the ecumenical nature of our initiative, just like the one that you're in. And they really started to wonder, what would it look like to do that in our local community? Could we convene some kind of small ecumenical gathering to talk about calling? You know, it really is a great place of common, you know, interest for so many congregations. So what would it look like to maybe talk to that church down the street that we never work with necessarily, but could we think about maybe doing something around calling going forward? And then several churches talked about how they wish they would have done the strategy that others found successful, which was to launch an effort with kind of a kickoff event. So for example, I can think of a couple congregations that did maybe a half-day opening retreat around calling, and then introduce like a small group program or some kind of adult ed initiative, but really shining the spotlight on vocation with a big kickoff event was something that really worked well in terms of a strategic way to approach this effort. And then finally, a number of them said, you know, we really want to keep thinking about how to use technology to start vocational conversations. Whether it's, you know, going on work site visits with people in our community and videotaping some of that and showing it in worship, or maybe seeing technology as a place to engage young people in our congregation to think about, you know, what their sense of calling is. But thinking about technology was another place that we've continued to want to, you know, build more resources around vocation. So I know that's kind of a whirlwind overview, and I want to let you know that I'm going to be posting on our website some more resources from this program, a few examples of things that our congregations have developed. And, you know, this will be available for you to go back and look at that list again, because I do think some of those best practices and ideas were really helpful for us in thinking about how to structure this new initiative. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris now, who is going to talk about her congregation's experience of being one of these churches that worked on vocation. And you'll see that they ended up actually engaging it for quite a long time in their community, which is really wonderful. So Chris, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, you know what? I think that, can you just keep going with the slides rather than having me use my slides, Laura? Because I'm not able to share them.
Okay, yes, I will do that.
That's great. Okay. Great. So, there we go. Okay, thanks. And I'll just let you know when to go to the next slide, okay?
Great.
I was astonished to realize that this actually we started this thinking at Wellesley Village Church 10 years ago. And we wanted to put together a program for our congregation that we ended up calling GIFT, Growing in Faith Together. And it came out of a longing from many of our parents when their kids were starting the confirmation process in 9th grade. They said that they wanted to have something similar for themselves. So we paid attention to that, and also folks were expressing a longing for more adult education and more small groups. So we spent some time thinking about what that could look like. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So actually, we developed a program, Growing in Faith Together, which ended up being an exploration of Christian practices. And then we moved to Christian beliefs, and then onto an exploration of vocation. And we realized that there was a lot of interest and curiosity about it, but we also realized that we had in mind something that was pretty big. We wanted many people in the congregation to be involved in it. At the same time, several groups working alongside each other. And so rather than just jumping in and getting going and developing, building the plane as we were flying it, we actually took a whole year to do some planning for that program, to develop the curriculum for it, to really recruit, to be thoughtful about the small group facilitators we were recruiting. Every group, it turned out, ended up with two facilitators, one to really help the conversation move along, and the other to keep track of the dynamics. And then also, if somebody happened to miss a week, it worked out all right for the group. They didn't lose any ground. So we spent quite a bit of time recruiting small group facilitators and helping folks understand that being a facilitator is very different than being a teacher. That when you're in a small group, it's really about holding the space for others to begin to do the exploration that they need to. We also knew that if this was going to be a big project of the congregation, that we were going to need time to promote the program and to recruit the participants. So we spent a lot of time sending letters, extending invitations, having conversations with folks, and helping them clear their calendar for the year ahead. And we also needed to make room in the church calendar in order to be able to do something on a consistent basis on Wednesday evenings. So we needed to move some things around. So really that whole first year, we spent the year getting ready, and it was worthwhile. Go ahead and move to the next slide, Laura. In year 2 is when we launched it. You can go back one slide. Yeah, year 2. Year 2, 2010 to 2011. And we put together a program that was 22 weeks long. And we did ask people to make that kind of a commitment. Now, of course, along the way, people did need to miss a week or two at a time. But the groups were consistent enough that folks were really able to take a journey together. We ended up in the first year having 60 adults in small groups of 8 or 9 with 2 facilitators as part of the group. Those groups actually were constructed pretty carefully because we knew enough about our folks to know some of the interpersonal dynamics that we expected would work well and some that would be a challenge. And so we actually were mindful of that when we put the groups together. We also wanted this group, this happened right alongside our confirmation class of 9th graders, which met on Wednesday evenings. And so 6 times during those 22 weeks, the adults met with the 9th grade confirmation class, that there were 9th graders who were assigned to each group, and we met together for community building and conversations about faith and for prayer with one another. I would say that facet of the program, as exciting as it sounded to us, it was much more challenging, and it continually felt to both groups that we were interrupting each other. And so we did that. I'll tell you what happened as we move along. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Laura. So Christian practices, these were some of the topics that we took up: community, prayer, testimony, discernment, worship, and forgiveness. Each week, I'll tell you that, that we met for an hour and a half on Wednesday evenings, and the first 20 minutes, 25 minutes was actually, everyone was together, and there was a presentation, a lecture, basically, to introduce the topic, and then everyone received discussion questions and then went off to rooms for their small groups. And so we first looked at these Christian practices. Go ahead and move to the next slide. And then we picked up Christian beliefs, creation and covenant, and who is Jesus, and the Spirit, and the church, and then our own denomination, the United Church of Christ, and also the particular gifts and calling of our own congregation. So we spent at least a week on each one of these. Actually, Jesus got more than 1 week. And as we were moving through this. And again, it was a lecture for 20, 25 minutes, discussion questions, and people moved into small groups. Go ahead to the next slide. And then Christian vocation. Now, I'll tell you that as we were still working on Christian beliefs, and we hadn't quite worked out what the Christian vocation pieces were going to look like, and it just so happened that I was at a meeting with Kathleen Cahalan, and she was telling me about Collegeville Institute's project on vocation in the midst of this. And so in the limo ride on the way back to the airport, I sat next to Kathleen with my notebook and my pencil, and I said, "Okay, Kathleen, can you please tell me everything that you think I should read?" And it was a lot. It was pretty overwhelming. But so on the one hand, I felt really well equipped to go back and to plan these last few sessions. But on the other hand, we also realized at that point that we hadn't left nearly enough time to talk about vocation. Go to the next slide. So at the end of that first year, I'll tell you that when we put together the gift program, we thought we were developing a curriculum that we were just going to keep repeating year after year with a different group of people. But at the end of the year, folks said, well, we're completely exhausted. 22 weeks is a long time. It's a lot. But they also said, what's next? And we really paid attention to that. And we also remembered, all of us, that we hadn't had nearly enough time to focus on vocation. So someone suggested, and I even remember the conversation and how much clarity there was around the table, at the dinner table, as we were evaluating the year's program. Folks said, well, what if we just focus on vocation for the whole time? That's our topic for this next year going forward. So that's what we did. For 20 weeks, we focused on vocation. And all those questions that are in front of you, you know, what does God's voice sound like to you? What are the core commitments of your life, of your faith? Where is God's call in the midst of that? What unique gifts do you bring? And who is God calling you to be and also to become? So again, it was, you can go to the next slide. It was a group of about 50 people. At this point, half of them were the same group of people who had been in the program the year before, and half were brand new. And at first we worried that there was going to be a sense that the new folks were going to have to catch up, but it really didn't work that way. We were able to introduce all of this in such a way that folks were able to get on the same page together. I'll back up for just a minute and just tell you that when we started this focus on vocation, in particular, we had a sermon series on vocation as part of it. And then also we were really fortunate in the midst of all of this that Kathleen came to Massachusetts, came to Wellesley, and led a retreat with us on vocation. And all these topics that you see here, these, for those of you who are at all familiar with the Call to Life and Call to Work programs that Collegeville has put together, the curricula, these are all topics that we drew from for that. Our format was still to have a 20, 25-minute lecture. So all that reading material that Kathleen had given me was really helpful in putting those presentations together, as well as all of the material that's in the curricula, the Call to Life and Call to Work programs. We did, because we went for 20 weeks, we did add some other pieces to it. We invited everyone in every group to take the Gallup Strengths Finder survey. We knew that, you know, there are lots of instruments out there to discern gifts, but this one happened to really speak to our congregation, and we had a lot of fun with this. And people were surprised sometimes by what came up for them, but also in the conversations, in small group conversations, people were able to really help each other claim their gifts, things that they hadn't seen in themselves, that they were, and that was really, it was a lovely thing that happened in the midst of all that. You can go to the next topic, next slide. So these are some of the resources that we used, the materials from Collegeville, the Gallup Strengths Finder. Everyone read Parker Palmer's book, Let Your Life Speak. That's actually how we started the series together. And then a couple books on discernment. As part of both the first year of the gift series and this year, and then actually every year going forward, we drew on Parker Palmer's book, A Hidden Wholeness, where he talks about the practice of circles of trust, inviting people to gather in a circle, and you present an issue or a big life question that you have, and people in the circle ask lots and lots of open-ended questions of you, and then reflect back to you what it is that you hear. It's the Quaker practice of a clearness committee. Parker Palmer has developed a whole system around it called Circles of Trust, and there are lots of really helpful practices. And that book actually outlines all the practices of that. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Because out of that, in addition to the gift program, a side ministry developed, discernment circles we called it, which is very much just our own language and practices around the circles of trust material that we had learned from Parker Palmer. And this was one of the wonderful things about this, is that it was an intergenerational team. 8 adults and 6 youth formed. And we created for the congregation this opportunity for them to have this experience of a discernment circle. For if they had a question or an issue in their life, they could come to the discernment circle ministry, and people would listen to them and ask them lots of open-ended questions, and just listen to them reflect on what was going on in their lives around this particular issue, and then to reflect back to them what we heard. And it was really, it was a really lovely ministry. And at first, I'll have to tell you that when we first started the practice that Parker Palmer introduced to us with the circles of trust, people were very uncomfortable with it, and they didn't, but we knew there was something important in it. So we kept trying it out again until this ministry developed. And over the next couple of years, 11 people came to the ministry and asked for to be a part of a discernment circle. There were a few folks who were in the midst of looking for new jobs who came to this, somebody who completely changed their profession in the midst of this. There was a senior in high school who came to the discernment circle because she couldn't decide which college she wanted to go to. There was someone else who was really struggling with aging, and that her body, she kept breaking bones, and she wanted to have conversation about what it is that her life was going to be going forward. So it was to be able to hold that kind of space for members of our congregation just felt like a really beautiful thing to do. Go ahead to the next slide. In year 4, we just kept going. At the end of every year, I'll tell you that that in the evaluation process, where we brought all the facilitators together and talked about the year and what worked well and where the challenges were. But at the end of that meeting, we then spent some time thinking about, okay, so what's next? What's the next thing? So year 4, the focus was on prayer. For 15 weeks, we shortened the time. It became pretty clear to us that the 22 weeks was becoming a real impediment to a lot of folks, and so we shortened the time. We went from January to April, so the beginning of the year all the way to, and we usually finished up right after Easter. We would meet one time after Easter. And these are some of the topics that we that we covered. Everything from the biblical traditions of prayers to prayers of intercession and lamentation. These are just some of the topics that we covered. And then, of course, we ended with blessing, where we all had the opportunity to bless each other. And then the next year, year 5, go ahead to the next slide. The next year focused on the topic of discernment. And one of the things that folks asked at the end of year 4, they said, you know, we would like to spend more time in our small groups. So everyone said they'd be willing to do some reading to prepare for the groups. So we gave up the lecture at the beginning of the session. We did come together at the beginning, but it was for a very short time of devotions and some housekeeping details. And people then got about an hour and 15 minutes in their small groups each week. The topic this year was on discernment, and we used a curriculum that came out of Companions in Christ, is a set of curricula that's developed by the United Methodist Church. It's a really beautiful curricula, but I'll tell you that it didn't quite work well for us, partly because there were some things about it that were not our vocabulary, and that was a good learning for us. This was a year in which we didn't have a lot of time to do the work of developing the curriculum ourselves, so we borrowed this from the Companions in Christ, the United Methodist Church, and it was okay. But we at the end of the time, we realized that we needed to spend the time and do the work to develop our own curriculum. So year 6, go to the next slide. Year 6, our focus was on testimony. And I have to say that of all of the series that we did, this was one of my favorite ones, that we really took the time. We had a small group of folks who gathered the resources, the reading material for folks, and really spent some time over the summer developing the questions that we wanted to focus on. Go ahead and go to the next slide. By the way, Tom Long's book on testimony was a really important resource for us in this. One of the premise of that book is that we sometimes think that we're supposed to know what it is that we believe and then we articulate it. And he says, no, he said, that it happens exactly the opposite. We talk ourselves into faith. So it just underlined again for us the importance of the small groups and the theological work that they were doing, that people were growing in faith as they were sharing it with one another, as they were telling stories of their own lives and talking about their own experiences. Go ahead and go to the next slide so that you can see some of the topics. So the topics included testimony and hospitality. When was a time in your life when you experienced a deep sense of welcome and belonging? We also wanted to have folks think about their church membership. Why did they join the church and what did it mean to them? And then we turned to worship. Where have you experienced God's presence in worship? I have to tell you that as a staff, the answers that people gave us to these questions were really, really helpful to us. It felt like we were kind of evaluating the whole church's life in the middle of people telling their stories to each other about what was happening in their lives. And of course, we spent time talking about loss and grief and mentors. You can go to the next slide. There are more topics there. Testimony and money. And we had this line up actually right at the same time that our annual stewardship drive was when we were, and it was an important conversation in the midst of all that. And then of course, discernment, just continuing that thread all the way through, and then testimony at work. And then we ended with testimony and public witness. That was the last sessions, and actually was more than one session. So the conclusions, it unfolded over time in unexpected ways. We never had any idea when we started this how it was going to unfold over time. And so really taking the time to solicit feedback and to do evaluation was a really important part of this for us. It really brought clarity for the next steps. Recruiting and equipping and supporting the group facilitators was key as well. And then also that the sessions were strengthened when people, when we put into the hands of folks the reading materials so that they could prepare in advance. and spend more time in small groups. And it really worked out fine every single year, that half of the participants were the same as the year before and half were new. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour of what we did, but I want to stop talking right now so that we can have questions.
That's wonderful, Chris. Thank you so much. I think that when Chris and I were preparing for this, I said to her that I hoped we could lay a big buffet of ideas for all of you on the table. And I think we likely feel like we do have many ideas sitting on the table. So as I said before, we'll put some resources on the website, let you know when they're up there so you can go back and kind of think about a lot of these ideas again. But we'd love to take questions now. If you've got specific questions about what Chris has done and sort of how that all evolved, anything from her presentation, feel free to ask. If there's anything about that Exploring Vocation and Community program or any of the particular projects that the other congregations did that you're curious about, I'd be happy to answer that. Or if there's, some particular ideas that your team has been asking and you'd love to get others' feedback on, now would be a great time to do that. So just go ahead, wave your hand, and we'll just take some questions now for the remaining time we have together. Yes, go ahead, St. Mark's. We're not hearing you. Let's see, okay, there we go.
There you go.
The congregation that was close to Collegeville that you mentioned, that did something in conjunction with Lent. Which congregation was that?
So several of them, yes. It's Resurrection Lutheran in St. Joseph, Minnesota. So they're a really small LCA parish. But they did this whole focus during Lent. They really kind of thought we're going to just dive right into it during that time. Yeah, so that was the church that was closest to Collegeville. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, Carol.
So Chris, when you were doing this, how did this new thing differ from the educational program or spiritual formation program that you did before you started it? Like, was this a new idea of having people commit weekly to groups or Bible study, or was it really different for your church?
We had a few years earlier had a 25-week program that we did in conjunction actually with another congregation, an Episcopal congregation in Boston. So there was some experience with that. We also have had experience of long-term Bible studies. People who did the Disciple Bible curriculum, which is a big commitment, 34 weeks. So the idea of having an extended time was not a completely new idea, so that was helpful. I mean, I think that in a congregation that's not used to having something every week for such a long time, that you might have to build up to it in order to be able to sustain it. On the other hand, when I think about my congregation here, there are some groups that meet every week. Our men's group meets every week. Our women's spirituality group meets every week. So that's an easy way for them to be able to get on board, I think.
Great, thanks. That's a great question. Other questions? Yes, Kelly.
So I am intrigued by that list of questions. Name a time when you had a deep sense of welcome and belonging. Is there any place that there's a list of those questions? And before you answer, I'll let you know why I'm curious. St. Matthew's is going to do the Bishop Porter Taylor Sharing Faith program over Lent, and there are 28 questions that are all good vocational and faith identity questions, and I'd like to collect more so that we can do more of that work.
Sure, I pulled those questions right out of what it is that we developed. It came out of a brainstorming session, as we were getting ready to start the series on testimony, and I saved them all. So I'd be happy to send them to you.
Yeah, that'd be great. We could put those on the website too. I think those
Yeah.
are really helpful. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. Yes, I think up at St. Mark's. Was that Eric that raised? Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi. I'm curious if people have been thinking visually how they've displayed this to the congregation in thinking about projects. We have a couple ideas, but I'm curious, have people been enrolling artists in the midst of thinking about this? Sometimes we're so into doing more things that we miss the other senses. I'm curious if people have been thinking about that.
That's a great question. I was wondering, I thought of St. Benedict's table. I didn't know. I know you often have, you have a large population of artists, and I didn't know if any of that had been part of your work yet visually. Yeah, Jamie, yes.
There we go. The short answer is no, not yet. Although one of the things that we, as our little leadership team has been talking is, we've begun to wonder about, okay, for part of our project, would we intentionally resource our musicians in their vocation as musicians, whether they're doing it professionally or just for the love of it. So I actually find that question really, really interesting. And even to tie it into Lent, generally during Lent at the front of the church, right behind the communion table, we have for the last few years put up an icon, for lack of a better word. One year it was an empty chair, and the question that rang all the way through Lent was, who's missing, who's not here? And then it was a table and chairs set up with a coffee cup and some other things on it, and it was meant to represent the call to hospitality and to the sharing together of story and meal. So as this was unfolding, I was thinking, Rachel, we haven't talked about our icon, so I would love to hear if anybody has a brilliant sort of an image or a visual that for them has come to represent this question, because we might just use it.
That's a great question. And I'm looking back over this list, trying to think if any ideas come to mind. But I agree with you, Eric, that I think we can get really heady in this vocation work. And I think thinking about different ways of engaging it. I mean, I had to laugh that the Lutheran church that I mentioned had this puppet ministry. When they first floated me the idea, I was like, really? Puppets? It was great. They had some woman who loved doing this puppet ministry, and she laid out this beautiful little curriculum she was going to do with the kids. And so she wanted to get new material to make these vocation puppets. And I thought, talk about thinking outside the box, And I know I probably am starting to sound like a skipping record, but this really is a chance for your congregations to do some experimental things. There's no, you can see even in Chris's example of like, every year they sort of reinvented what they were doing. I mean, they had a format, they took what worked from last year, retooled it, played around with it, but there's really so much freedom in this project for you to do that. So to think about, what would that like to engage some artists in your congregations, to think about, visually how you might start talking about a sense of calling. I think that's a great idea. And I think the fact that so many of the churches that we worked with were really interested in kind of collecting people's stories or like these video clips they wanted to show in worship. In some ways, that connection between like visually seeing someone tell their story, I think they understood that was different than just like reading it on a web page or in a bulletin or something. It was like really to see that the embodiment of calling in someone's, story. So to think about, that as part of what your project might engage too could be really interesting. So that's a great question. Thanks for that. Any other thoughts about, what your teams are working on? Anything else you'd like to ask the group? Now's a great time to crowdsource questions like that, if there's anything you're interested in or thinking about. Chris, I have a question if nobody else does. I was curious to know, you talked about how you kicked off, I don't remember if it was every year, maybe the first year, with a sermon series. And I was interested if you did other things in worship that would kind of go along with what this group was doing, you know, as the more intentional kind of adult ed or their formation, this program. Was there anything else that you did to connect where that group's, you know, where they were at with the church year or anything like that, just kind of making that connection to worship?
Yeah, I'm remembering that every year, if it wasn't there were sermon series. I remember we did a series on vocation. We did talk about testimony and worship. Discernment became just so much a part of the vocabulary of the congregation. You know, it's part of who we are in the UCC. Our congregationalist tradition is that, you know, one of the reasons why we have so many meetings, we say, is because you never know through whom the Spirit's going to speak. So everybody's got to be there. But other things in worship, I need to think about that a little bit more. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure.
Any other groups we haven't heard from yet? Other questions or comments about what Chris shared or about that other program? Yeah, Deb. Oh,
There we go.
there you go.
Okay. It's interesting to me, and I feel like I'm.
Oh, we got both Debs. Whoops. Okay, go ahead. Yes, Deb. That was funny. You both had a question. Go ahead, Deb. Keep speaking. We'll get Deb Anderson in after this.
Oh, okay. What feels very concrete and validating to me is that one of the things that we just discussed this past Sunday at a meeting we had, building on those things that we're already doing. I was taking notes, like the practices that we already have in place, and those engage that could be one of our strategies in like making this project come to fruition. We've done the Called and Gifted program here for years. We did it for many years. We haven't done it in a while, but should that be something we pull back in? And this whole idea of it's there. It was something inherent to St. Francis. So how do you build on that and let it bubble up? So that was very validating. And then I don't know if you all remember, but I shared that the Stewardship Committee is doing all these images that we're putting up during Lent that are pictures of our family doing out, you know, the things that we do. And that, and I was so moved when we did the Visio Divina with the St. John's Bible. So one of the things we've tried, and I would love to see us even do more, and this to me is one of those artistic ways of thinking outside the box, is looking at those images that are us, that are like the pictures you hang on in your home on the wall, and doing Visio Divina type prayerful reflection with those, and tethering that to scripture and watching that unfold. So I'm really excited to see how all that, those are just the thoughts I have right now, and I'll unmute myself and let the other Deb speak.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Deb. That's a great example of another icon. I love that. Go ahead, Deb.
I guess I know that I don't think Ingrid or Ann are on this because they typically have staff meeting on Tuesday afternoon, but I just feel like for the three of us going forward, I'm going to propose that we watch the video together, because I think if we're all there together seeing and hearing the information, I just think it's going to be able to help us kind of take that first step forward for Holy Trinity. And, you know, I love the fact that you guys say, it's like, you know what, if you try something and it doesn't work, that's okay. Just try something else. And I think I would really like us to see is like, let's take that first step. Let's see what happens. If we're going, if it's a misstep, that's okay. We'll just change direction. So I think for the three of us, I really want to see the three of us watching this together and then kind of creating a real concrete next step.
That's great, Deb. I think that's a perfect place to have us sign off here as it's 2 o'clock. And we do hope that you will be able to go back. We'll check this out. I'll also just put the PowerPoint up there too if you want to skip back to any of the particular questions or slides. You don't have to listen to the whole hour again if you don't need to. But thanks to each of you. I hope this was helpful. Please feel free to shoot us an email if there's any lingering questions you have after the webinar ends. Because we know that many of you are in that place of really starting to ask some concrete ideas about what next year is going to look like for your project, and we want to be a helpful resource for that. And this will be the last time you see our face for a couple months, because we're not going to send you anything and bother you during March and April. We really know that that's quite an important time of prayer in your congregations. But we know that you are still doing a lot of work behind the scenes, getting ready for what will come in May and June. So we will be in touch if there's anything we can help with around that. So blessings to each of you till we see your faces again. And thanks again. Take care.
Thank you.